This lesson is going to continue with the manipulation of conditional statements. So far, as I stated here, we've introduced converse. Converse was switching of the if and the then. So we were switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. And then we went through biconditional statements. So biconditional statements were when we realized that the original conditional was a true statement. Its converse, after we switched the hypothesis and conclusion, was a true statement. And when both statements were true and it could go forwards and backwards, then we had that biconditional. So now there are two other types of manipulations that sometimes can happen. So when you watched the Alice in Wonderland, they just did the switching of the converse. But the others now are going to include that negation concept that we talked about. So the first one is called an inverse. So what an inverse does is it's going to negate the hypothesis and negate the conclusion. The words are going to stay in the same order, but they're going to be negated. And then the other one that we have is called contrapositive. So what a contrapositive does is it's going to negate the hypothesis, negate the conclusion, and it's going to exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So in really fancy words, basically the contrapositive merges the converse and the inverse together. So the longest word does the most amount of switching. So let's see what it looks like. So here's an example. So if I start off with an example that says, if a dog is a Great Dane, then it is large. From the previous lesson, the converse is going to say, if a dog is large, then it is a Great Dane. They just switch the order. Now let's introduce the inverse. So what the inverse is going to do is it's going to say, if a dog is not a Great Dane, that's that negation, giving it the opposite value, then it is not large. That's going to be the inverse. So notice we added the word not. Now, when we talked about negation on the previous page, just flip for a second to remind you, when we did these negations, we add the word not when we're negating. If a statement has the word not in it already, we'll take it out. So you might have scenarios where you have to take it out. And then the contrapositive is where we're going to do a combination of these converse and the inverse. We're going to negate the conclusion and bring it to the front, and we're going to negate the conditional and take it to the back. So we end up with, if a dog is not large, then it is not a Great Dane. So let's try one together, and then I'll have you try one. So if you like chocolate, then you will like M&Ms. So again, don't worry about the truth value on these right now. We just want to talk about how do we switch it around? What's the manipulation going to be? So each of these sentences are still going to stay as if then. Notice they all start with if and have then in the middle. Start with if and then in the middle. Don't forget to always start with if. So our converse from the previous lesson is if you like M&Ms, then you like chocolate. Didn't give a lot of space for writing, but so now let's talk about the inverse. So we're going to negate this original sentence. So the words are not going to switch order. We always go back to that conditional when we go to the next type of manipulation. So we're going to negate this. Instead of saying, if you like chocolate, if you do not like chocolate. And then the conclusion, you will like M&Ms, then you will not like M&Ms. Now let's try a contrapositive. Go back to my conditional. So we're going to negate the conclusion, bring it to be at the front, and then we're going to negate the hypothesis and take it to the end. So we're going to start with, if you do not like M&Ms, then you do not like chocolate. So you try this second one. Be careful on the second one because notice my original conditional has nots in it. So take a minute, pause the video, try to converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So hopefully you paused, and now let's look at what you should have had. So the converse to the original conditional statement. So again, the original conditional was if you do not go to the movies, then you will not eat popcorn. Your converse should be if you do not eat popcorn, then you did not go to the movies. Your inverse, going back to your original and saying you are not going, instead of saying you are not going to the movies, if you go to the movies, then you eat popcorn. And the contrapositive, going back to the original, we're going to switch and negate. If you eat popcorn, then you go to the movies. Okay, so I switched the camera here mid video. Sorry, it's Friday. It's Dress Down Friday. But I want to show you my conditional statement dance. So unfortunately, if you were here live, I would be making you all do this. And if you show up for the Google Meet, I'll make you do it there in your own home. I should make everybody turn their cameras on and show me this. This is my conditional statement dance. So I start off, and you're going to notice I've written if and then on my hands. So I have if and I have then. And so I always start out and say we have conditional, converse switches. Always go back to the conditional, inverse knots, and knots on the back of my hand. Always go back to your conditional, contrapositive, does both. So it's my, if you are anybody who enjoys learning routines, here's a routine to help you sink those vocabulary words into your head. So I'm going to do it a couple times with you. So I start out conditional, converse, conditional, inverse, conditional, contrapositive. Again, conditional, converse, conditional, inverse, conditional, contrapositive. Go back again, conditional, converse, conditional, inverse, conditional, contrapositive. Go back, conditional, converse, conditional, inverse, conditional, contrapositive. Okay, so I'll go back to the notes now. So I had to give you that breather break for a fun little memory of how to learn the vocabulary words. So just at the bottom, I wanted to go over a couple geometry things. But if you ever take a class in college, they do have logic classes entering college. And a lot of times in there, you really start to evaluate the truth of sentences. And we do what are called truth tables and all sorts of things like that. So this is just a general statement for you to know that any conditional statement and its contrapositive, they always go together. So if the original statement was true, the contrapositive will also be true. If the original was false, the contrapositive will be false. So they pair up. So conditional pairs up with contrapositive. So if I'm looking up here, conditional always pairs with contrapositive. They are a pairing. Oops, let me slide that down. And then the other two which pair up are my converse and my inverse. They also can go together. So if the converse is true, the inverse is true. If the inverse is true, the converse is true. So those are our pairings. They are called equivalent statements. So that is our lesson on manipulating statements.